Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, How to Think Like the Japanese. Thank you all for joining. We always appreciate seeing lots of new faces and some familiar friends as well. So thanks again. We're together for about an hour. So hopefully we'll at least start to scratch the surface of this fascinating topic, I think, around understanding the Japanese mindset and how to work and communicate much more effectively with Japanese counterparts. My name is Kathy Wellings. I'm the director here at London School of International Communication. I think some of you know me already. I'm going to do the boring bit at the start and just give you some housekeeping and explain for those of you who are new to our webinars how things work at these sessions. You may have noticed you're all on mute. Unfortunately, we won't be able to hear your voices or see your faces as we have, yes, quite a large group today, which is great to see. But that doesn't mean you can't join in. We try to make these sessions very interactive. Some of you are familiar with these tools, but let me show you very quickly for those of you who perhaps haven't been on this kind of webinar before. Just a few very simple tools that we can use. Obviously, I can see most of you have discovered the chat already and are introducing yourselves, so thank you. That's nice to see everyone. Probably the most simple thing we can do is put our hands up. So you may see a little man with I think he's a man, with his hand up at the top of your screen. Yes, I can see some of you have found that already. So you can put your hand up. Rob might ask you a yes or no question during the session, and you can just put your hand up to say yes if that's the case. The other thing that we may ask you to use is to annotate some of the slides. You should see down the left-hand side of your screen a toolbar with various little icons. So there's a T, which is text. And then two up from there, there's a pen, a marker that you can use if you're feeling more creative. So you might just want to try that. So, for example, if you take the marker, you can draw, or you can write something, or you can cross things out, or you can put question marks, you can draw smiley faces. That's all good. So I think hopefully you've found that, no worries. Do take your hand down if it's still up. And then I'd just like you to raise your hand if you haven't found those tools, if anyone's having trouble drawing or writing. That's looking good. So I think we're all okay. But please do use the chat function throughout. We'll make sure at the end of the session there's time for questions. But if you have a burning question partway through, write it down. If we can, we'll stop and answer it in the moment, but otherwise we'll make sure we go back to all the questions at the end. Just one last thing, we're recording the webinar. You'll get that in an email tomorrow, hopefully. So feel free to share that with any colleagues or friends who haven't been able to attend the session live today. So I think I'll stop talking now and I'll introduce you to Rob. Rob is a very experienced intercultural trainer. I was thinking earlier today, I think, Rob, we've known each other for about 12 years now. So you've certainly been working in the field for that long, if not longer. Spent 5 years living in Japan, still travels back there regularly and is a real fount of knowledge when it comes to all things Japanese. So I'm going to mute myself now. I'll be back at the end to help deal with questions. So I'll leave you all in Rob's very capable hands and see you at the end. So enjoy and please make sure you join in.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I should bow. And so welcome to this session on how to think like the Japanese. I hope that you can all hear me fine. And just to introduce what we're going to be looking at today, just a few questions. We're going to think about stereotypes about the Japanese. Are they true? I'm interested. Indeed, one of you has just said, Hajime mashite, dozo yoroshiku. So that's very nice. Nice to meet you too. The second question is, how do they see themselves and their place in the world? So we'll have a think about the Japanese and where they stand in the world and how they generally see themselves as individuals, as a nation. Um, and I don't know, I hope to give you an insight into the Japanese mindset. Of course, I have to start off by saying I'm going to be generalizing, and it's very difficult to generalize about cultures. Think about yourself, you know, how typical you are of where you come from. I think we're all typical in some ways and atypical in others, and the Japanese are the same. So we do need to be careful in our sweeping generalizations about people. But I hope that we can gain some insight today, and yeah, I hope to pass on some different perspectives, ways of seeing, and I hope that you gain something from this session. I would like to ask you to do a poll now, which you should be able to see on the screen. This is to find out a little bit about your experience. So have a look down the list and please click on this, and you should be able to see the results as well. Have you been to Japan? Have you visited Japan on holiday? Have you studied there? Have you been on business to Japan? Do you have Japanese colleagues at all, but have never visited Japan? Or have you lived and worked in Japan? And indeed, are you Japanese? So I'll give you a minute to look at those. We can see the percentages, and it's interesting that around half of you are saying that you haven't ever been to Japan. So I hope that I can give you some interesting insights. But of course, some of you have lived and worked in Japan. That's around 6% of you who have done that, who have Japanese colleagues, and around 12% of you have been to Japan on business. So you will have some experience of actually being there and knowing the culture from the inside. Yes, and I think you can tick more than one, I guess. So it's really interesting to see your experience and how you approach this webinar, you know, and what you're looking for. I should say throughout this, feel free to write anything in the chat box. Any questions you've got, that's absolutely fine. And yeah, just yeah, I'm sure you can sort of engage in any way you like with it, and also, you know, you can raise your hand as well. I'll try to look at keep an eye out for that as well. Great. So those are our ideas for today. It's to look at stereotypes. It's to think about how the Japanese see themselves and their place in the world, and to think about what this idea of a Japanese mindset is. So I'm going to move on. I thought I'd start with a few quotes and a bit of background information just to set the scene. And the first one is from Lafcadio Hearn, a very sort of famous, in Japan as well, very famous British traveller to Japan. He actually settled in Japan for a long time. He had a Japanese wife, but he travelled there in the second half of the 19th century when Japan was opening up to the outside world after a long period of being closed to the outside world. And he expresses in a very interesting book the strangeness of Japan. So this is written, you know, 120, 130 years ago. But he says it produces a queer thrill, impossible to describe, a feeling of weirdness, which comes to us only with the perception of the totally unfamiliar. Now, I don't know whether that's, you know, still exactly the same when we go to Japan. Some of you have said that you have been there and that you've studied there and that you've, you know, visited there on business. It's not a completely different planet, but it certainly feels like there's something different going on. And the way that I heard it described was a different center of gravity. You know, there's some kind of different, I don't know, force or feeling about the place, even if you're getting on a train or you're, you know, buying a ticket or you're going into a restaurant and eating food. It's, you know, absolutely recognizable, but there's something different about the way that the Japanese do things. And the second quote talks about that. It talks about a very significant trend in Japan, which is the sort of sense of doing things together. And what we get when we experience Japan, a strong sense of who is inside the group and who is not. And this is what allows Japan to function so seamlessly and harmoniously. When you see the transport system, when you see how things work in business like clockwork, the sort of image here from Pico Aya, who's a long-term resident of Kyoto, but sort of British Indian heritage, it reminds him of an orchestra in which everyone is playing from the same score and everyone knows their part perfectly, and everything goes beautifully as long as everyone does their bit. So I think this is definitely a sense that you get when you live there. I was there for 5 years and immediately felt that there was something communal going on. And what I think is interesting when you live in Japan, and those of you who have done that can maybe give your thoughts on this later in the chat box. You have to join in order to be accepted. You can kind of play along and play the foreigner card and be different. But to really understand Japan, you have to kind of acquiesce, really go with the flow and try to, become part of it. And then you begin to understand the Japanese mindset. So those are my sort of opening points about it. And in the background, of course, we have a long history that marks Japan out as something different, as a very sort of interesting place that's different from a lot of other places. Of course, through history, a long influence of Chinese civilization, but to be honest, nowadays it's more reliant on the United States for security. We can even see today that Japan wants to have, that close relationship with the United States because it's about security, especially in terms of North Korea. But it has lots of issues out in the region. I think a very important point to understand Japan is that it was cut off from the outside world, self-exile. And it's a really important part for understanding the Japanese insularity. So the Japanese were kind of self-imposed exile for around 250 years, leading up to the middle of the 19th century. And they really had a desire to become a great European power in the Orient. They wanted to be on a par with the great European nations. They looked at, the British Empire and they thought, well, we would like to have a bit of that. But of course, even today, their relations with their neighbours are affected by what they did, the atrocities they committed, and the territorial aspirations they had. In the sort of first part of the 20th century. It's really important to stress that the Japanese see themselves as unique in the world. If you go to Japan and you speak Japanese, they are always amazed. Even if you're speaking very simple Japanese, they will be absolutely astounded that you can say, konnichiwa. They will be absolutely amazed. So I think it's interesting, but I just wanted to make the point to begin with here that the Japanese are not as unique as they think. Of course, there are many things that are similar. And also they're not quite as homogenous as they seem, as in all of the Japanese, they see themselves as just Japanese. And actually there is a certain amount of diversity, not on the same level as in Europe or in North America or many other cultures, but there is a certain amount of diversity there. So 1.5% of the population is non-Japanese, and that includes 1 million ethnic Koreans who actually don't get all of the benefits of being citizens. They still have to kind of, even second, third generation, have to keep an outsider status in Japan. So it's certainly an insular place. Those are some points I've made. I don't want to go too far with this kind of lecture. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make it a bit more interactive. And I'm really enjoying the fact that you've got some comments, which you should be able to see. And some of you are pointing out the Nihon Jinron. If you're not sure about that, that's the Japanese myth of the Japanese-ness of their people as being unique. And then Hauke there, you've talking about your experience, which is very relevant, I think. And yeah, the idea of being accepted. So this point about homogeneity, the Japanese are very clear about who they are and see themselves as unique, and it's very difficult to get inside Japan as an outsider. Okay, now it's time for you to use a bit of the interactivity here. So what I'd like you to do is to have a look at this question. Which European country's culture is closest to Japan's? So if you go across and get the draw function, the marker, and then put a tick on the one, or more than one if you like, that you think is closest to Japan. Yep, you can scribble, you can circle, I don't mind, but we'll see what you think. This is just to collect your thoughts on actually the similarities that might exist between Japan and other places. Of course, we might talk about the differences, but we want to look at the similarities. And, you know, if I could talk with you, it would be interesting to see why you're saying that Japan is like the UK. I have a number of ideas that I'll show you on the next slide. But if you could finish off putting your thoughts there, we've got a few for the UK. I think that's the most. We've got quite a few for Switzerland. We've got some for Germany, and then a few others: Finland, Italy, Denmark, France. No one for Spain at the moment. So I think that's very interesting that you put that. Sweden. Okay, so someone's put Sweden up there. So what I would like to do now is just to go through why I think Japan is actually a European country. It's interesting in history that Japan has aspired to be like the European powers, and in some ways there are aspects of every culture that are like European countries, but of course it's very distinct. So I would say the Japanese are absolutely obsessed with food. So you find this in Spain, in France, in Italy, of course many other countries. Not really the UK, but there you go. So the absolute focus. And I think someone's just said it depends on what aspect you look at, and that's absolutely my point. That you look at things in culture, and it really depends on your perspective, and this is what we're trying to prove with this. Again, Japan is categorized as a hierarchical society. I think it's very interesting to see that certainly the boss is the boss, and people say that the French have a kind of hierarchical structure in their organizations. But it's still different from the Japanese. But at least the boss is the boss, and you have to look up and show respect in your language, for example. And the Japanese, in language, has always a lot to do with showing respect through language. They feel comfortable when there is a clear structure to the hierarchy and status differences. They don't feel uncomfortable with it, like a lot of Western cultures. They like formality, and they are uncertainty avoidant. So in terms of affinities and similarities, the Japanese and the Germans have a lot of similarities in that point. So the idea of focusing on the process, the idea of, for the Japanese, it's kind of doing things in the right way. And I was just in Berlin just a couple of days ago, and again, a very, free and easy city, and a fascinating, place. But there's still this focus on getting things done in the right way. And maybe it's stereotypical, but the Germans, certainly their stereotypes are in line with the Japanese stereotypes there. And in my experience of working with Japanese and non-Japanese in companies, I see that this is one of the big issues. The process orientation of the Japanese can often clash with other cultures in Europe or beyond, because they just don't see the system. They want to have a system. I wanted to highlight that the Japanese are very much focused on cleanliness of just their environment. They are very neat people. They don't drop litter. So sometimes it's embarrassing to look at European places and see all of the litter on the streets. In Japan, go to Tokyo, it's very clean, just like Switzerland. It's just really clean. And in fact, if we look beneath, and this is what we're going to do, we see that there's an incredible focus on purity, on cleanliness. Taking your shoes off when you go into your house. Of course, that's very important in Japan, because why would you want to bring the outside world into your private space? You've got to be clean. And then I put a few more here about communication. So the Japanese can be as silent as the Finns. Okay, stereotype, of course, you might meet a talkative Finn, but in general, it's a cultural generalization that the Finns are quite taciturn. They don't, like to waste words. And this actually goes back to a samurai code in Japan, that it's the fool who sort of blabbers and talks a lot, and it's the wise person who sort of keeps quiet, contemplative, reactive, and not just talking yourself into a hole. So I think in that sense there's an affinity with the Finns. And then we come to the British. Okay, there is a similarity there, and many of you ticked that box. So I think when I went to Japan myself, I felt, of course, first of all, that Japan was a different planet. But the longer I stayed, it felt like there were some interesting similarities in terms of the sort of reserve that people have at times, um, and yeah, vagueness. We can treat vagueness as an art form. The Japanese certainly go in for that. They're probably one of the most indirect communicative cultures on the planet, and then quite insular. I don't know how the Japanese see Brexit, but I think they would fundamentally understand uh, this British bloody-mindedness, wanting to keep yourself separate from a continent, because that's what the Japanese do as well. They keep themselves separate from the rest of Asia. They see themselves as different and distinct. So they probably understand that, but they probably wouldn't understand why we decide to do something apparently illogical, which is to cut ourselves off from our biggest trading partner. I'll say no more on that. So we've also got to talk about tradition. So part of my presentation today is to think about tradition and also modernity, but the Japanese are certainly traditional. People say that they're very traditional in their view on gender. So maybe the Italians can be a little bit like this as well. Women are women, men are men, and they shouldn't really kind of cross over in any way. And other cultures are quite a bit more open. But the Japanese are certainly traditional and love their traditions and just preserve their traditions in such a careful way that it is absolutely amazing and an amazing experience to really experience the traditional side of Japan. And of course, it's very attractive to a lot of Westerners and other people who go to Japan to experience that side. I've put the Japanese are as communitarian as the Danes. Communitarian, I think, what I mean by that is that they're all together, and there's a kind of tall poppy syndrome. In a lot of Scandinavian countries, you find people try to keep each other down. It's not good to boast. And the Japanese are like that, sort of valuing not putting your head up too far. Of course, there's a famous phrase in a Japanese kind of proverb that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. It can be quite a conformist society. So maybe there's a little affinity there with the Danes. And finally, I've put that Japan is not like America, not like the United States. I think if you want to look at two cultures that are furthest apart in terms of cultural differences, you could probably find America and Japan on the opposite ends of the scale. But it's really interesting. For Japan, America is, always has been a kind of, the aspirational place. You look in adverts on the television, even though it's a kind of narrow space, not much space, all of the adverts for cars on the television and on the billboards are all about space. It's all about big vistas and deserts and that kind of thing. So it's interesting. America is kind of the undiscovered country, the opposite, and therefore sort of a desirable thing for for Japanese. So with that, what I've tried to show is that, yes, absolutely, as one of you said, Viveka, it depends on what aspect you look at. It really is amazing to see the collection of different values in Japan and how, depending on where we come from, we can sort of see similarities, we can pick up on particular approaches. And of course, that's the fun of traveling to other cultures, and in particular in traveling to Japan, where we see just a different way of organizing, a different combination of values. What I'd like to do now is just to move on to something a bit more artistic, let's say. I thought I'd offer you something a little bit different, and we'll look at the applications of this and of different values in business scenarios in a bit, but here's a bit more interactivity for you. So I'm testing your knowledge of particular cultures here, particular concepts. So Japanese aesthetics. Have a guess, which of these do you think is not a Japanese aesthetic value? And if anyone wants to, give their cultural knowledge and define these, then feel free. I can see some ticks coming up there. Yep, you can circle it, I don't mind. Great. So aesthetics, often the way that we see the Japanese is as a spiritual sort of people, the beauty of kind of Zen, the sort of Zen approach, Zen Buddhism, a very sort of pure approach to living. So we often see this. It seems that many of you are, split between Pechakucha and Fukinsei. So I'm going to reveal the answer now. Pechakucha is not a Japanese aesthetic value, as many of you realized. Pechakucha is really interesting. Look it up, actually. It's a very interesting Japanese invented style of presentation. And maybe next time for this webinar, I'll do it because you have 20 slides and you're supposed to use the slides, but only 20 seconds each. So the Japanese invented this. They like sort of conciseness and constraint. The Japanese are into kind of constraints. So it's a way of doing a presentation. A bit like a TED Talk. They have meetings for Pechakucha, but it's kind of very short presentations and very visual. The Japanese are very visual in their approach. So there is an aesthetic link there, but it's not really an aesthetic value. It's look it up. It's really interesting. So what I've put up there for you are some aesthetic values, which are interesting. The Japanese sensitivity about nature can be explained by wabi sabi. Again, it's an interesting one to look at. It's a kind of liking for the faded and the ancient and the not quite perfect. It's sort of the feeling of being lonely in nature. And this is seen as a nice thing. So the Japanese like to get out to nature. They live in very crowded cities. But it's a sort of the idea of nostalgia, of loneliness as a kind of reflection as they go out into nature. It's seen as a sort of, in some ways, a romantic notion for the Japanese. So look it up and see what you think about that. Fukinsei is a similar concept in aesthetics. Basically, this means a liking for things that aren't symmetrical. Again, imperfection in Japan is seen as beautiful, and when you see a lot of Japanese art, it's all about sort of imperfection and asymmetry. There's a sort of famous sequence of drawings which are just circles. Okay, just drawing a circle, but it should not be perfect. If it's perfect, it's not interesting. So again, this could be considered a Japanese aesthetic value. And then I'm going to include kawaii under Japanese aesthetic value. And for those of you who are familiar with this, it's debatable, but kawaii means cute. And it's the tendency for the Japanese. This really comes from manga and anime, the sort of comic books and the animated films, the whole genre which the Japanese excel at, and it's their sort of biggest soft export in many ways, and they attach a lot of importance to it. But the idea of kawaii, very interesting when the Japanese were handed the baton for the Olympics in Rio. What did they do? They built a tunnel between Tokyo and Rio, and out of the tunnel popped Super Mario, this computer game character, a very cute character, and lo and behold, it was the Prime Minister of Japan who was dressed up as Super Mario. So talking about the kind of the soft power of Japan and its computer games industry, but it's kawaii, it's kind of cute. And in society, you see lots of Japanese, just carrying around cute little, cute sort of things, key rings, and all sorts like that. So it can be interesting to see that middle-aged ladies walking around with sort of fluffy handbags in the shape of children's characters. It can be really surprising. So there's an interesting sort of aspect of that can be, again, from a Western point of view, it can be interesting, or from a different cultural point of view. So there are some of the aesthetic values that we can find that are particularly Japanese, a particularly sort of different way of looking at art and a different way of thinking about romanticism or about aesthetics. So I thought I'd put in a bit of that into today's webinar. But I want to go a bit further and find out what you know, and many of you have experience. So now we're moving on to kind of the heart of the webinar and my presentation. But again, I'm going to ask you for your experience and your thoughts on this. So I put up some specifically Japanese concepts here. So I wonder, can I ask you to raise your hand if you're familiar? You know, go up there and raise your hand if you're familiar with any of these concepts. And if so, in the chat box, can you write down, you know, this term and what you think it means and how it might relate to what it is? It would be great to have your thoughts on this. I'm going to read them out, and then of course I'll explain them as we go through. The reason I'm presenting these is because I think it gives us some insight into the Japanese mindset. Nope, not many hands going up there, and not many things going on in the chat room. So let me explain a few of these. So I is okay, someone's writing something. That's interesting. Wonderful. Okay, so someone's writing there. Fantastic. So very, very good. I'm glad you're writing this in. My ambiguity is absolutely right. So this idea of ambiguity in communication. And then we've got wa, which is harmony down the bottom. Absolutely correct. So this is harmony. And then very good. You've got the idea of inner and outer feelings, which someone is writing, and we've got that written there as well. And yeah, we've got enryo, which is restraint. You're doing really well with these, so you know you're very knowledgeable. And if you look in the chat section there, you can see that many of you are very familiar with this, and you can, you know, actually look at these concepts. It helps us to understand what's going on. There's also a question mark. So what good, kata as well, the way of doing something. So if you are familiar with martial arts, again, you may be familiar with kata. And again, I think it really helps to understand what's going on. Okay, Toby, no worries about your writing. That's fine, I can read it. Good, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put forward an official definition, and then I'm just going to try and apply these, because I think from living in Japan and from interacting with Japanese for many years, I think, you know, you could highlight these concepts as being really important for understanding the Japanese mindset. Let's see, Kathy, I wonder if I could ask you to sort of take away the writing, and then we'll look at my official definitions. I thank you very much for your contributions. But aimai, first of all, is an indirect approach to communication. It is about ambiguity. And as we said, there may be some affinities here with the British. The tendency to hedge, the tendency to kind of not give a straight answer. And it can be very frustrating if you're doing business. So certainly the Japanese are known for this, and they prefer an indirect approach to communication because it's often about how you get on with other people, about maintaining, in effect, Japanese harmony, you know, the harmony between people. They also have a real distinct approach, which is to really try to show that they care for their guests by, in some ways, anticipating what they need. So predicting the needs of a guest. And this can be great. It's a wonderful sense of hospitality. The Japanese are, you know, maybe the most hospitable people on the planet. Certainly feels like that when you go there and get incredible hospitality. Sometimes I think living there for a while, it could go too far. You could actually say, well, can you just treat me normal? I'm a foreigner, I'm in Japan, I don't want to be treated differently. So it was interesting, but they would treat you differently. They'd bring you a knife and fork in a restaurant. You say, well, that's all right, I can use chopsticks. But omotenashi is a very, you know, endearing trait, which is Japanese want to be hospitable and treat their guests well. And in business as well, I think you can find this is very, very important. Enryo is, I'm putting here, an unease with physical contact. This is the sort of not the direct translation. you already put that there. It's reserve. It's sort of just keeping your distance, giving people space. And the Japanese, in their very crowded cities, often they don't have a lot of personal space, but it's very, very important to maintain that personal space. And the Japanese generally don't touch much in public. Very rarely, I mean, in private, okay, but in public, it's very rare to get much touch. Um, and then something very, very important is kata, as you pointed out. And I've put this as a desire to perfect processes and rule out uncertainty. You can find this in Japanese approaches to planning, in any approach to doing things, the process orientation, the perfectionism. They're looking to rule out uncertainty, and it comes from many cultural reasons why they want to do this. They will want to perfect things. I remember attending classes in Japan for calligraphy, and it was all about using a brush in a particular way, and then drawing lines. For the first hour, I had to just draw a line, put the brush on the paper, and then draw a line, and then lift the brush off the paper, and then again, to the next bit, and then put the pen down there, draw a line, and then lift up. And that was kind of what I was doing for the first hour. And yeah, as Viveka has just said, it was a bit of a tough experience because the sensei, the teacher, would come behind me and say, "No good, no good, no good, no good," and this would go on for a few minutes, with my pitiful efforts to draw a straight line, and then he would say, "Good," and I said, "Oh, why is that good?" And then I could see why it was good. It was strong. It was a strong line. It was not symmetrical, but it would have been placed with purpose. It would have been drawn nice and straight and then lifted off cleanly. And you found there was the right way of doing things, and it comes through almost endless practice. So the Japanese want to practice. They want to sort of practice things, and if they don't get the chance to do that, they really don't feel comfortable. And then something else that is very important for the Japanese is a need to reach consensus in a yes, it's just like Karate Kid, yeah. The need to reach consensus in a non-face-threatening way, especially in decision making. So this is nemawashi, and the process called ringi, which is sort of rubber stamping. You put your stamp on a piece of paper and it goes around to all of the stakeholders in a particular decision. And very important, this is why decision making takes a long time. But on the other side, in Japan, implementation is quick. It's because everyone has reached consensus in a non-sort of threatening way, respecting the hierarchy. And once you've got that decision, then everyone is on board and nobody will dissent after that. A couple of other issues which I think are important for understanding the Japanese mindset. A distinction between formal and informal situations. So for the Japanese, if you meet Japanese in business, generally they will be using tatemae, which is kind of like a mask, a formal mask. They will not show emotions. They will not reveal a lot of information because they want to check whether it's acceptable to reveal that information. They will not give a lot of personal opinions because what do their personal opinions have in terms of relevance? They should be giving an official opinion. So this is why the Japanese are often known for saying yes when they mean no, which can be very frustrating, but it's because they're using tatemae. Yes is the answer they think you want to hear, and it would be embarrassing for them to say no, and they would affect someone's face, their own face, or someone else's face. So it's a part of face in some ways. It's a distinction between formal and informal situations, and from that you can see that it's very important with the Japanese to build up relationships, and that is what karaoke is for. Finally, as you said, wa is a Japanese concept. It's harmony, and it's harmony in interpersonal relations. I'm not saying that the Japanese don't have arguments. They do, but they tend to keep their arguments away from the public eye. You don't do your dirty washing in public. You tend to keep things behind closed doors. A boss may be very, very direct and have a go at their subordinate in the office. I've seen it happen. It's scary. But that's internal. In general, they want to keep harmony and will avoid direct expression of displeasure or of disagreement. So, this is it with the Japanese. They really are pretty informal and pretty indirect in the way that they approach communication because of this focus on harmony. Again, from an international perspective in history, you might not say that the Japanese are always harmonious, but it's kind of part of their society to want harmony. You've also got to say that Japan is one of the safest societies that I've ever lived in terms of crime. So, they have organized crime, Yakuza, but it's organized, and it's not the same kind of atmosphere on the streets. You get very little street crime in Japan, and maybe it's something to do with this value of harmony. Right. I'm going to give you one more scenario in our presentation, and just to think about this idea of communication. In a team meeting, your boss compliments you on your contribution to an important project. How would you respond? Again, if you pick up your marker and quickly indicate. How would you respond here? Good, there's quite a range of different responses there. Of course, I didn't add other. Maybe you would do something different to this. Yeah, and most of you are going with the very polite thank you. This is what's interesting about the Japanese. They are most likely to go for D, and they would do this. It's kind of could be interpreted in a different way, but they would wave their hand in front of their nose and sort of turn a bit red, but sort of look down and sort of go like this a bit. So it's really kind of saying C, but they wouldn't say it. And it's deflecting. It's deflecting any praise. They feel very uncomfortable if they are complimented. They're not going to sort of say, "Hey, thanks, it was a great job, wasn't it?" You don't really get that in Japan. And also what's interesting is that in Japan, basically in Japanese companies, you very rarely get complimented. If you've done a good job, basically that's good. The bosses will carry on because you're doing your job, which should be good. So it's an interesting point that the Japanese don't expect to be complimented in their work because they're doing a good job. They should be doing a good job, but that's what's expected of them. So I don't know how often this actually happens in Japan. So hopefully that's an interesting point for you. It's about etiquette, of course, different responses. It's fascinating to see how the Japanese respond. They can be very Japanese in the sense they are, quite unique in the way that they respond in particular ways. But of course, they have emotions. They don't want to stand out too much. They're of course happy if you compliment them, but they will show it. And I think this is the difference between cultures. They might show it in different ways. I'm sort of looking at Japan, and I do want to sort of stress that some of the aspects we've looked at today are rooted in traditional values. And the Japanese you meet today, especially the young Japanese, may not conform to a lot of the traditional values that we can see. So I think what I'd see in general in Japan is a bit of movement from the more collectivistic to the individualistic. Japanese in general are very much into doing things for themselves and for expressing themselves through fashion, through nice products that they can buy. They're very much a materialistic and consumer-based society. So they're not as conformist and collectivistic as they maybe used to be in past decades. So the Japanese you find in Japan today are probably a bit more individualistic than they used to be. I think there's evidence that the younger generation are more direct in their communication style. Of course, this is moderated by the fact that many of them speak reasonable English, but understand that you have to be a bit more direct and a bit more informal when they're speaking in English. And I think generally they don't have any problem doing that. They may well like the informality of English, as many people do, rather than the sort of stiff formality of their native Japanese language in business, for example. But we have to say even young people in Japan struggle with English, and it's not necessarily an easy thing for them to express themselves in English. So that's one thing to be aware of. I think it's certainly interesting to see different elements in Japan of egalitarianism. Even in some companies, it's very much about people working together. Um, and I don't know, there are examples of more free-thinking entrepreneurial companies in Japan that adopt a particular culture influenced by the West in many ways. So yeah, many examples of companies these days that are a bit more free-thinking and open and egalitarian, and also maybe results-orientated rather than process-orientated. I think Japan tries to be outward-looking. It struggles sometimes. It still has a very large domestic market, 127 million people. Kind of, they can try out all sorts of things in that size of population and keep it domestic. But the Japanese are interested in sort of engaging with the outside world, of coming out of their shell. And they are certainly curious about the outside world, and they're also curious about how we see them. So I'm sure that they'd be interested in what I'm saying today. So shifting values, I think there's certainly, Japan is a country in flux at the moment. Economically, it's in a different position to what it used to be. It's in many ways a zero growth society, and maybe a model for us in the West, certainly in Europe, to look at a culture that is a zero growth economy, but maintaining very high levels of standards of living. So I think we've got a lot to learn from Japan in that sense. And that sort of brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm going to open it up to you now to ask any questions that you have. So please feel free to write some down or to comment on anything that we've covered. We can go back and look at some other slides if you wish to. And I'm happy to explain a little bit more about some of the concepts that I've spoken about today. But I'll just, as you think about some questions, I'm just going to cover this last slide here, a summary. As I said, it's very difficult to generalize about cultures. We need to be very careful. When you encounter people from another culture, don't assume that they are a stereotype, a walking stereotype. But I think it's very important when in Japan and dealing with the Japanese to, of course, be sensitive to status, and really, keep your distance, show respect for, in particular, senior people, because there are, in some ways, dangers of assuming that people like informality. There are times when the Japanese don't mind informality, but in a formal business situation, they want to stay formal, and therefore, try and follow their ideas around formality. Using surnames, putting san after the surname is very good practice because it shows respect for the other person. In terms of kind of physical space, I would recommend you to keep your distance from the Japanese. Don't stand too close. If you've ever had a conversation with a space invader, it's not very nice. You want to take a step back. That's often how the Japanese feel about us. So don't come in too close. They won't like it. It's really good to take your time with the Japanese. Expect things to take time with the Japanese. They like to take time to reach consensus. Don't push for immediate decisions, because the more you push, the more further back they will go, and it's not necessarily constructive. And then finally, before I have a read through your questions, remember to take your shoes off. I remember making the classic gaijin foreigner mistake in Japan, going to a restaurant, and it was the kind of traditional Japanese restaurant where people take off their shoes. And so I took off my shoes when I went in, sat down at a low table, knelt down at a low table to eat my food, and after a while had to sit down because my legs had fallen asleep. But when you get up, you go down and put on some clogs or some slippers to go to the toilet, and then come back. And you're supposed to, of course, leave the slippers behind when you come back into the restaurant and step up onto the platform of the restaurant. But of course, if you're not used to it, you forget and end up walking all the way to your table wearing nice pink plastic toilet slippers. And everyone will laugh at you and say, ah. I think most foreigners sort of make this kind of error at some point, wearing the slippers that you're not supposed to in a particular place. So remember to take your shoes off. Okay, I'm just going to have a look. We've got a few questions, as you can see. And Toby is asking a question about work teams in Japan. Yeah, this is about socializing and yeah, drinking culture in Japan, which is very strong and very important. The Japanese do like to go out drinking because they can kind of get to know each other, drop their guard a little bit, and I would be careful of the sort of here it's the Christmas party syndrome of getting drunk and then sort of revealing all to your boss or doing something you regret. Um, I think certainly the Japanese can let their hair down and they can be much more open in their opinions. Um, and it is forgotten the next day, as in it's not talked about the next day. But I'd say be careful, it's not necessarily forgotten. Okay, so they believe that going out and socializing is a way of cementing and establishing and cementing a relationship. So you can certainly be more open when you go out drinking, and that's the point of doing it in an informal, pleasant environment. But do be careful. Don't be too direct because it will be remembered. It may not be commented on. And don't get completely drunk because, well, okay, you might do, but try and keep a control on things. Having said that, I went against that advice on numerous occasions in Japan. And then Hauke, yeah, I'm just going to look at your question now. So yes, asking about to what extent the Japanese are willing to adapt to other cultures. I think lip service is an interesting point there. Yeah, the Japanese like to do things their way, and it's just relating back to their values of trying to kind of rule out uncertainty. If they do things in a Japanese way, then they know the outcomes. If they start to do things in a different way, then they don't know the outcomes, so they're not so comfortable with that. In that sense, I don't think they're that much different from other people, but they are quite stuck in their ways, and they are quite uncomfortable with doing things and stepping outside of their comfort zone. So yeah, I think they will try to do things in their own way, in a subtle way. They'll kind of stick to it, and it's interesting. The Japanese have a tendency to accept other ways of doing things, but do their things in their own way at the same time somehow. So I think that's a very good question, Hauke. We've got a couple more here. So one from Max and one from Toby. Toby is picking up. Sorry, Victoria there is picking up from the drinking culture. In terms of drinking, it's true that it's not considered very ladylike to be drunk and falling over and so on. But women are certainly part of work teams. They're maybe excluded from the later evening activities, going out to other bars where men may be catered for by women. They're called hostess bars. Catered for, I mean, really at the level of their drinks poured for them, looked after. The women laugh at their jokes, and it is quite a male environment there. But kind of the Japanese do it in stages, so they will be inclusive earlier on, and it's fine for Japanese women to be part of that, but it isn't seen as very feminine to be drunk. So there are different standards for men and women in business in Japan. It is more difficult for women in Japan in general to be considered, well, to take part in a lot of rituals that the men do later on. But yeah, as Viveka says, it's still not that women are excluded completely, and certainly there are more women in the workforce, often in the part-time roles, but there's certainly more women in the workforce. Okay, I'm going to have a look at another question now. We have many questions, which is wonderful.
Rob, hi, it's
Yes.
Kathy. I'm conscious there was a question. There's a couple from Max. There's one further up which we may have missed around. I think, Max, what you're asking is how far would Japanese companies expect us as Westerners to be aware of the concepts and so on that Rob's been outlining? Would they expect us to know about all these different concepts, or can we play the ignorant foreigner to a certain extent?
Yes, good. I mean, it's a great question, Max. I think going back to a point I made earlier, often the Japanese don't expect outsiders to know, about Japan. So they would be surprised if you started using some of these terms. But I'm sure, if you asked the Japanese about these terms and to explain them, then they would, be interested in explaining them for you. But they wouldn't normally expect you to know them. Even, the idea of nemawashi. It's interesting. Nemawashi, I explain it a lot for business people and, go into a lot of detail about how it works. For the Japanese, it's kind of like an instinct. It's just a sort of traditional way of making decisions and of organizing. So it's more, it's not so conscious for them. We are doing nemawashi at the moment. It's more just we are working. So it's interesting. They may not be so aware of these terms as you are if you attend webinars and training and read books on the subject. So it's a good question. Yeah. Anything else that I've missed?
There's another one around from Max again with the working culture. Is there a sense within Japanese companies that they're more productive, considering the longer hours that they traditionally at least work?
Yes. Again, are they more productive?
Another interesting question.
Indeed. I don't know whether you could say the Japanese are productive or more productive. They certainly do have a long work hours culture, and have to stay in the office for a long time because they're not supposed to leave before their boss. But I'm not sure whether they are necessarily productive all of that time. They take a lot of breaks, they drink a lot of coffee, they go out and smoke cigarettes, and they do a lot of talking. They do actually do a lot of talking. They spend a lot of time in meetings kind of talking around subjects. So I don't know whether they're that productive. It's presenteeism, as Laura has just pointed out, that is interesting. So I think they find it interesting when they go to Germany, for example. We talked about some similarities between the Japanese and the Germans in terms of their attention to detail, which could be a bit much at times, but very different from the Germans in terms of their attitudes to time and spending that time. The Germans want to finish on time in general, and if they don't, it's seen as inefficient. The Japanese don't have that same sense. You stay as long as you're supposed to stay, and you may not have much to do, but you're supposed to be there to be available just in case.
Great, thank you. I think we are almost out of time, so thank you so much, Rob. That's been fascinating, and I'm sure others will agree that we could stay on and continue exploring for a lot longer than the time we have available, unfortunately. But I'll just wrap up very quickly, and I think if anyone does have any questions that we haven't been able to answer here and now, then please do email them through to us. And obviously, if you're interested in exploring in more detail, we do run longer training courses where we really can go into a lot more detail and explore some of these issues in more detail according to what you're doing. Just a couple of words from me in terms of what's coming next. Our next webinar is kind of bringing it back home, and we're going to be looking at British business culture and what that means today. And I also just wanted to share with you, as well as the kind of bespoke courses that we can run for our clients in your offices, we run a series of courses here in Holland Park in West London, and we have a whole suite of courses coming up in May, and we always like to extend a promotional offer to our webinar community. So if that's of interest, the web link is there, and again, just contact us if you have any questions or you're interested in doing any of these things with us. But otherwise, stay in touch. We'll be sending out details of the next webinar in the coming weeks. Follow us if you're not already, and then you'll see our updates and our blogs and so on. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining and for your participation. And thank you so much, Rob. It's been insightful as always, and a pleasure to listen to you. So thanks again, everyone, and see you next time.
Bye then.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Rob. Bye.